How's it going? My name is Cameron, also known as Venus Theory, and in this video, I'm here to give you some tips on mixing your drums with PSP plugins. I love these plugins for drums because I think they add this really nice sense of grit and punch and warmth to a drum mix and really make things nice and big. We live in this age of ultra clean, super digital plugins, and while I think there's a time and place for those, I think these plugins really bring out that extra bit of character and mojo to a mix and really help things stand out. So let's dive in and get started. Alright, so here we are in Cubase with the project open, so I'm going to go ahead and just play a segment of this drop section here so we can get an idea of the drum mix we're going to be working with today. We can spread this love on fire. So as you can hear, it's this big, heavy song, and it's got these big, loud drums. So now we can go ahead and take a listen to the drum mix soloed out here. So one of the things you may see right away is that I like to layer my drums quite a bit. So I've got regular Foley kick sound, a synthesized kick, a synthesized snare. I've got percussive Foley elements here, cymbals, a bunch of other Foley percussion layers and things like that. So I like to make these fairly dense drum arrangements just to keep things moving and add a lot of, layers and ear candy, I guess. So when it comes to mixing these drums, I just wanted to walk you through a couple tips I have with PSP plugins that I like to use when I'm doing drum mixes. So the first thing I wanted to show you is this kick right here. So if I turn off the effects, it's just a Foley sound. I believe this is me hitting my garbage can. And what I've done is add just two things to turn it into something a bit more weighty and punchy. So the first thing I've added here is Mixbase 2, and this is an excellent plugin for adding some low-end harmonic energy to pretty much any sound. So I like to use this for two reasons. One, that I can add those really low, subby, big, deep frequencies to something, but also this punch control allows me to add a lot of mid-range knock, which is especially important for kick drums. So in this case, I've just adjusted the tune control here till I found a point where it really started to bring up that low-end weight, but it has plenty of kind of mid-range bark to it, so I didn't really need this punch control. After that, I just adjusted the bass level a little bit because it was just a bit extreme, and we've got this big, heavy sub-bass and 808 thing going on, so we don't want this kick or the other kick to interfere. So just dropped that bass level and then mixed it in about 40% and engaged output saturation. So beyond that, I've added the Master Q2, and this is a really, really cool EQ because it allows you to add just a bit of color using these controls down here. So I usually use the soft saturation mode. I don't know what it is about that. It's just very pleasing, almost harmonic distortion, I guess is what I would describe it as. So what I've done with this EQ is just bring up a little bit more energy around 50 to 70 hertz just to bring up that real low stuff. Ducked out a little bit of boxy stuff around 250 to 400. Usually with kick drums, there's something in there that doesn't quite sit right. And then just use the high pass here to just cut out all the super duper low subby stuff because we're not going to need it. So in terms of the second kick drum layer here, this is a synthesized kick sound and it sounds like this. Which is fine, maybe a bit flat. So what I did is add an all-pass filter effect here and then the MCQ, and this is really, really nice for what I'm about to show you, and that's the output saturation mode, which is something I'm sure I'm going to reference quite a bit more. And this is really what makes this kick sound. So with the MCQ, just to bring this up to something a bit more interesting, with a completed sound is this. So what I've done is overdrive the low end and engage the output saturation. So what I'm doing is just boosting this low end so much, like a pretty extreme amount, 4 dB at about 70 hertz. It's quite a bit. This is really going to help drive this EQ and make it break up in a nice way. The mid-range band here, I boosted around 500, which is a pretty nice frequency to start with when you want to add a bit of knock to your kick drums, which is really, really important to cut through in a mix, especially on smaller speakers. And then because this kick was synthesized using a little bit of brown noise as well, what I did is boost around 3-ish K. And this just helps bring up kind of a, I guess, a upper mid bark to the sound. I'm not sure how to describe it. So if we actually gain compensated for what we're doing with the EQ, the kick drum's going to end up sounding like this. Which is a nice kick drum sound, and I think it's, you know, it's got a pretty fat low end, and, you know, it hits pretty hard. But by overdriving this, we really get this kick drum to hit super hard, and that's something to experiment with on just about any sound, really. Just overdriving the MCQ a little bit can really make sounds start to jump out and have a lot of kind of character and vibe to them. So in terms of the actual kind of bread and butter EQ and processing, my favorite kind of go-to thing out of all the PSP plugins for EQing is the MCQ. And this is just an excellent EQ because one of the things I like most about it is it's not very visual. You know, I'm not seeing a spectrum analyzer and all the curves. You know, it forces you to listen, which I think is super important when you're mixing. But this is a great EQ for drums and vocals. This is kind of my go-to for both applications. So this is the synth snare layer here, and I'm going to go ahead and disable the EQ and the reverb. So it's this big metallic synthesized snare sound that I made, and I really just wanted to bring that up just a touch more in the mix. If we go ahead and play it right now, you'll hear that it's just not quite up front. But once I go ahead and enable this EQ now, you'll hear it just jumps out just a little bit more. So what I wanted to enhance with MCQ here was just kind of those ringing metallic tones and a little bit of that fundamental beef on the lower end of the snare. So I boosted around 140-ish, a little boost here at about 2K, slight boost around 6.4 just for some kind of presence lift, and then engaged output saturation. This is a really cool control on most of the PSP plugins, or if not all of them really. This is something to definitely play around with, especially when you're doing like kick drums or sound design stuff. Just using this and overdriving the EQ and just clipping things a little bit can sound really, really nice. So beyond all that, the last thing I kind of wanted to show in this video is achieving a really nice stereo width to sound. So one of the things I do in a lot of my tracks is I stack cymbals to get this really wide sound. So this is the completed cymbal sound here, which is nice and bright and big, and has this really large reverb on it just to push it back in the mix and just make it sound super duper large, just because I tend to gravitate those more cinematic-y sounds. I tend to just like those really big sounds, which can make mixing very difficult. So what I've got here is the MCQ, and I'm actually only doing one thing with this, and I just engaged the low-pass filter just to cut off some of that super-duper top-end information, because without that, both of these crashes are very, very noisy. I made these with like an 808 and just some filtered noise, so they're very, very bright. So I tend to just shave off a little bit of that top end depending on where I want them to sit in the mix. So after that, I just added the stock Cubase reverb. So I'm well on my way here, and I was pretty happy with the sound, but I wanted it just to sound that little bit larger. So one of my favorite things for this is the stereo controller. There's a preset called Extended Width, which just extends the width a little bit. And this is a really, really nice thing to have for cymbals. So if I A/B this here versus this, you hear, especially towards the top end, things really start to spread out in a nice way. So once I double this up on both crashes here, we can go ahead and A/B that. So this is without that stereo enhancer. But once we add it on there, we get these really nice, bright, wide cymbals, which I think really, really suit the mix. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to show off here is my parallel compression chain for the drums. So if we go ahead and bring up my mixer, and we'll just lower this, and we'll go ahead and just play the mix once more. You can hear that these drums end up getting pushed back a little bit. They still hit pretty hard, but they're just not quite up in the mix. So using parallel compression is really, really nice for that. And you can hear once I do that, those drums really start to jump out. So if we open the actual mixer here, I can kind of show you what's going on. With parallel compression, one of the big things is not to send everything in your drum group or drum rack to it. So what I've done is send kind of the important elements. So I've sent both kick drums full volume. The synth snare I took off a little bit because it's a very loud sound. These two Foley snares are going in all the way. The hats are coming in just a little bit, just to kind of bring out a bit of that tickiness to them. And then these crashes are coming in with just a little bit more energy. So the actual parallel compression chain here, let me go ahead and find that right here. What I wanted to show is actually that I like to do this in kind of a two-step process and a bonus little third trick. So the actual parallel compression is coming from FET Presser, which is easily one of my favorite compressor VSTs. It sounds so good, and it just makes everything sound better. So this is the setup I've got here, and I'm taking off a pretty extreme amount. So you see I'm taking off, 12 or so, 12 maybe a little more in some sections on the peaks, and usually, no less than 6, really. Like, it's quite a bit of compression. And then the attack and release settings I would just play with. This really comes down to the tempo of the song, as well as the drum sounds I'm using and what I'm sending to it. So I might adjust the attack to let more of the transient through, or squeeze the sound super hard if I want kind of a squashed room mic feel. And then the release is really just down to the tempo of the drums and the song. So this is a pretty standard setup. And what I do to go kind of one extra level to this is actually throwing Mix Saturator on. And I do this on my vocal parallel chain as well. Mix Saturator is a really great tool just to add that extra bit of kind of funk and mojo to just about anything. And usually it works best in pretty subtle amounts because it can go pretty hard. So what I've got here is just a really basic setup. I just adjusted the warmth and softness a little bit. I think I left everything on the standard settings except the low end. I just ducked that down just a bit because these kick drums are very big. Saturation about 40%. It's on valve 2 and mixed in about 80% with the output saturation on. And this is a great way just to add a bit more energy and life to the parallel drums and the drum mix as a whole. So I've got it bypassed, and we'll enable it, and you'll hear the difference this makes. And you hear it just kind of grabs the kick and the snare especially, and just gives them a bit more kind of punch and aggressiveness. So the little bonus tip I wanted to give here is actually using the Noble Q. And this is one of my favorite PSP plugins. And, it's a great little EQ and just adds a nice bit of color to things. But the thing I like most about it, and what I might do in some cases, especially if I'm doing a drum bus, and not in parallel, what I'll do is add the Noble Q to it and just give it a little bit of a low end lift, and then enable the attenuation just a little bit, just to kind of clean up those, low end frequencies, because those can get pretty unruly. And then, I might add a bit of air up here with a pretty broad curve, shelf and boost, just a little, just to bring that up. But the thing I recommend you try out is actually this little section here, which doesn't look like much. And even if you just left this on the default preset and did nothing to it at all, what I would do is just grab this little knob here, which adjusts the saturation curve, I believe. But just by moving this up 1 or 2 ticks here, and then driving the output a tiny bit, this will really make things slam. So this is great for drums in particular, across any genre, really. I love doing this on rock mixes too. But definitely try this out on the valve mode. It adds quite a bit of weight and character to a drum mix. And that's it. So thanks for watching. And if you want to check these plugins out for yourself, you can find them today at PSPaudioware.com.